Welcome to Ethics Matter. I'm Stephanie Tsai. Our topic today is vast. We're talking about China with one of the world's preeminent experts on the topic, Orville Schell. Orville has written 15 books, 10 of them on China, and he is currently the Arthur Ross Director of the Center on U.S. China Relations at the Asia Society. That is a mouthful. Mr. Schell, it's such an honor to have you here at the Carnegie Council Studios in New York. It was hard to decide which topics I wanted to focus on for this interview because there are security issues at stake. There are human rights issues. There's climate change. But I want to try to focus the conversation really on our focus at Ethics Matter. So viewing some of these topics through an ethical lens. And I actually want to start with trade and globalization and the threats that President Trump has made to levy tariffs on foreign imports, including Chinese goods. It made me think about the fact that as we focus on the American worker post-election, I thought about the hundreds of millions of Chinese workers who have actually benefited from global trade and globalization, and how we view poverty and in international relations. Are we being selfish to only focus on our losses due to globalization?
Well, every nation has its own perception of its national interest, and the job of any government is to define that interest and protect it. And the dilemma we live in today in the globalized world is that in ways that are often hard for us to discern, our national interest is shared with the interests of other countries, because we have global economies, we have global problems, we have all sorts of things that we can only solve together. So this is a constant high wire act of trying to figure out what is our interest, what is their interest, what is our common interest. And I think lately China has become increasingly sort of obdurate about defining its interest. And it has, I think, a less evolved view in terms of being able to imagine its global interest. It understands the necessity of globalization, but the idea that sort of all men are brothers, to put it in Chinese terminology, I think is sometimes quite elusive to this country that has grown up over the last century with this Leninist doctrine that it is being exploited by the imperialist great powers outside.
It still feels that historical grievance, but all men are brothers is also not something that this country seems to be following.
Well, this country is something of a contradiction. On the one hand, we can be enormously self-serving, but on the other hand, there is a kind of a fundamental ideology that's grown up over the last few decades that we are sort of more or less in this together globally. The win-win notion of the global proposition. Now, I think President Trump changes that in ways that it could be quite stark, and we'll see what they are as we move forward. But I think China has always had a sense of its insularity, of being somehow not only cut off, and we had a big spate of that during Mao Zedong's time, but also of being preeminent. So this raises the whole other kind of very vexing question as China becomes more prosperous and powerful of how is it going to demonstrate that urge towards preeminence, at least in Asia and possibly the world as it moves forward.
President Xi Jinping gave a much ballyhooed speech at the Davos conference this year where he really heralded globalization. He said, quote, "We should advance democracy in international relations and reject dominance by just one or several countries. All countries should ensure that development outcomes are shared by all." What did you make of that speech? Did you take any sign from it that China is going to play a larger role on the global stage in ways that it hasn't before?
Well, nature abhors a vacuum. And I think the election of Donald Trump poses the question of will the U.S. sort of retreat from the global proposition and leave such a vacuum. And I think it was into that potential vacuum that Xi Jinping stepped at Davos with his speech on globalization. But I think his view of globalization is very different from the world of globalization, I think, that's understood, and to be certain, sometimes hypocritically by liberal democracies, but nonetheless that there are certain, shared propositions, and there are things such as the rule of law. It isn't a purely transactional world, although capitalism can be cutthroat. And there was also a kind of again, not always quite lived up to, but a kind of moral proposition amongst liberal democracies that is not shared by a one-party Leninist state. And so this, I think, puts China something at odds with this earlier notion that was confected in Europe and North America of globalization.
I've had a couple conversations in this same studio with academics who believe some of those liberal ideas you talk about are actually under threat now in this country under the Trump administration, which has openly called the press the enemy, which has questioned some of the foundational democratic institutions in this country. Do you think that, well, first of all, do you agree that some of those liberal ideas are under threat in this country? And what does that mean for an autocratic regime like China?
I do think that the whole notion of the virtues of liberal democratic open society is under threat, both within our own country by the election of Donald Trump, but also by the rise around the world now of these sort of, quote, illiberal democracies. It's very striking. And I mean, you look, the Philippines has recently come under the cloud of Duterte. You have China, Russia, Erdogan in Turkey, Viktor Orban in Hungary, the Czech Republic, even Poland.
How do you think Chinese leaders look upon that trend around the world?
I think they look at this trend with some surprise, because remember in 1989 they had the demonstrations and bloodshed in Beijing, and then the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union collapsed. And that was, remember, the end of history? Liberal democracy had won.
Right.
Well, it turned out it was a little premature to announce that funeral, because ultimately it turned out that illiberal democracy still had some firepower. And China then went on this burst of development and has turned to be something of a success on that front. So we now have a kind of a real competition going on, I think, that isn't simply military, it isn't simply economic, it is also a kind of clash of different kinds of political systems and values.
Is there a chance that the Chinese might rise to fill a moral vacuum, or are they not interested in that? Are they more interested in continuing economic growth and just the well-being of their citizens?
I think China has been somewhat prudent about its sort of expansive notion of assuming the various vacuums that have been created around the world by the threat to the EU, the sort of disorder here in the United States. On the other hand, I do think they have a deep and abiding yearning to right themselves rather more grandly on the global scheme of things. And I think that's very much in Xi Jinping's playbook, that this idea, in Chinese of a fuxing, a sort of a revival, a rejuvenation of China. This has been a long time coming since the collapse of the Qing dynasty in 1911-12. And I think it's very gratifying for Xi and many Chinese, and thus the source of nationalist sentiment, to see China becoming wealthy and powerful and being able to contend with what once they viewed as the great powers that were sort of pushing them around, the great imperial powers, Japan, U.S., Great Britain, other Europeans.
And when you think about the power of Chinese infrastructure projects overseas, or its Silk Road projects and its economic leverage in different countries, is that how it sees its rise, or does it end up playing a larger role on the global stage and in international relations in ways beyond that?
I think that, China's rise and its rather expansive sort of economic policies that were described as its going out policies have been quite successful and quite startling. A huge amount of money and involvement out around the world in various forms. But I think it is a very different kind of expansiveness than that of, let's say, the United States, which was always very evangelical in certain ways. It wasn't purely transactional. It was evangelical first because it was spreading Christianity and civilization. And then, of course, because it was spreading the notions of the free world and then liberal democracy, that we believed that history was ineluctably moving in the direction of more openness, more freedom, and more democratic systems of governance around the world. And China heaved to on the scene, started slowly moving around the world, and it didn't bring with it that kind of same assumption of that sort of imperative that things were moving in this more democratic direction. It was an authoritarian country, had no particular moral presumptions. It would trade with anybody,
right.
Robert Mugabe or Thomas Jefferson.
And it still does, which leads me to, the withdrawal of the U.S. from the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I remember during the Obama administration, when there were arguments for TPP, it wasn't just about trade. It was about this evangelism that you talk about. It was expanding worker protections throughout Southeast Asia. Environmental regulations and standards would be brought to be comparable to U.S. standards. Does the U.S. withdrawal from the TPP again leave another void in which you have, China filling that without the sort of moral presumptions that the U.S. was once known for?
Well, I think we're not quite sure what's going to happen, but clearly when the U.S. vacated the TPP, it left a giant piece of the fabric of a kind of an alternative structure missing. Because the whole strategy of things like the World Trade Organization was we build a rules-based system. China enters, and China, agrees to play by those rules. And that was the sort of theory behind TPP. You have environmental rules, you'd have play fair, you'd have, level playing field, this, that, and the other. So with that gone missing, now we run the prospect of China setting up its sort of trade structures in Asia and playing by their rules.
And what ethics and morals and concern for the environment and concern for worker rights is in their playbook?
Well, I think increasingly, actually over the last decade, Chinese leadership has come to understand the environmental threat, partially because it's threatening its own people, and its own people are unhappy. And you begin to get a lot of unrest around these environmental threats, which are, unparalleled in global history. So that it begins to understand. I think that the valuative proposition for China, one of the problems of the Chinese Revolution in the 20th century is that China kept trying to reinvent itself after the dynastic collapse. It had a Republican period, it had a communist period, then it had a Deng Xiaopingist period. And in the process, sort of the whole question of ethics, culture, values got really savaged.
Yeah. And
it kept getting changed and canceled and reformatted. But you can't really do that in a society and have a society keep its valuative sort of moral compass. And so China now is in a curious position where, despite its amazing success economically, it is something like a compass without a true north when it comes to values, because what values should Chinese believe in?
Right.
Confucian, Maoist, Adam Smith.
Does capitalism, does that become an overriding value? And
I don't think capitalism is a moral value.
no, I don't think it is either.
I mean, it's a very transactional dog-eat-dog world.
But has that become a religion in some ways?
I think it has
China.
filled the vacuum of values and culture. I mean, you have to remember that China underwent a cultural revolution. And we thought at the end of it in 1978 and 79, oh, well, that's over, that's good, let's move on. But I think we didn't properly appreciate the consequences of having a society attacking its own culture and values, what the impact would be going forward. And actually, I think what it was a sort of a profound, but also quite subtle, sort of defoliation of the sort of inner core operating system of Chinese society to know how to regulate itself insofar as any society regulates itself according to a system of values, ethics, of principles.
Can capitalism be seen as a value if it means, you know, I was just reminded that even though China is the second largest economy in the world, on a per capita basis, the GDP is still 1/6 that of the United States. So you still have a majority of the population that by our standards would be considered very poor. And can the government continue to talk about morality in the sense of lifting those people out of poverty? And is that a compass? Is that a north?
Well, I think for the Chinese Communist Party, such as it is in its latter-day form, this idea of creating what Deng Xiaoping called a reasonably well-off society is a moral imperative, and it is not one to be naysayed. It's extremely important. China was a very poor country, but it does not sort of complete the full menu, I think, of a society that has, you know, both its valuative compass and its sort of moral compass intact. It's a fragment of a larger view of what it means to be human, of how you view yourself as connected to your society, to the world, to your family, to your friends, to whomever.
Is there an ethical framework that guides President Xi, his leadership and his policy? And I guess the reason I ask that is he's very anti-corruption.
Yep.
And so do you feel like there is a moral framework that guides him?
I'm sure President Xi could articulate what, I'm not sure he quite put it in those terms, moral. I think he views his charge to keep China together, keep it stable, and keep improving people's lives. But you know, human beings don't live by bread alone. And there are these other very subtle things that throughout human civilization have meant a great deal to human beings, whether it's art, religion, you know, philosophy, one could go on. And I think those are the things that are a little harder to put your finger on in China, because you have to remember this is a country that identified its old culture, its traditional culture, all those thousands of years, with weakness. It starting back in the teens and 20s in the last century, it thought that's why China is weak. We have to get rid of it. We have to modernize. And then they borrowed from the West, they borrowed democracy, republicanism, capitalism, and then they borrowed communism and Leninism. Mm-hmm. And so they've tried all these things on. But in the process, I think there's been quite a bit of sort of as Mao said, you can't have construction without destruction. 不破不立. And they've destroyed a lot.
What do you think is the next phase of the revolution?
I think the revolution, the Marx part of the revolution is long gone. The Leninist part, which isn't really a revolution, it's a way you structure one-party system, you know, authority, hierarchy, orthodoxy, ideology, propaganda, the way you make a state powerful. That's what the revolution is now about.
As I was reading your bio, Orville, I read that your father, who's also named Orville Schell, was a human rights attorney, which I didn't know. And I wonder, how much that plays into your own view of China and its development. And when I started studying years back in college and I was reading your works, human rights would frequently come up as an issue. How have you seen that evolution in recent years?
Yes, my father was a lawyer here in New York and ended up being a co-founder of Human Rights Watch, and was he was a man of sort of deep principle for whom something like justice was a matter of importance. And I think in many ways, me and my brother and sister, my brother Jonathan was also a writer, it did rub off. And I think China, as you suggested, there was a period of decades when it was possible to imagine that slowly it was evolving, not only to be more prosperous and wealthy, but it was also evolving slowly towards becoming a more republican, more democratic, more open society. And that was this idea of history having a sort of ineluctable force. Xi Jinping, in a certain way, is an end of that, call it a fantasy, call it a delusion, call it a dream.
An end of that.
An end of that, because I don't think that is in any way or description describes his end goal. Now, even Jiang Zemin and even Deng Xiaoping, they were good Leninists, but I think they also imagined that, well, China would slowly change, don't push us too fast, and we will become more open, more democratic, and more convergent with the liberal democratic world outside. But I don't think that's what Xi views as his mandate. I think he has a very different view, which is some have started to maybe call the China model. It's authoritarian capitalism. And he doesn't view his country as slowly converging with the West. In fact, I think he may view the West as declining. And the whole set of principles, which to me are quite important, to live in an open, free, and democratic society. I'm sorry. That's how I would like to live.
Right. And I want to talk about one of what some have called, if you can call it, the virtues or the benefits of having an autocracy vis-a-vis climate change in China. So it was another thing that President Xi brought up in his speech at Davos, which was the importance of the major players, in other words, the U.S. remaining party to the climate agreement that was struck in Paris last year. And as you know, it was a big breakthrough that the U.S. and China were able to agree on emissions caps. What would happen if the Trump administration followed through on its threat to pull out of the Paris climate agreement? Would China be able to continue to make the case, and would it want to, for the reasons that you named and the fact that environmental pollution is actually an internal political issue for the Chinese as well? Would they be able to live up to those agreements? Would they?
Well, the Lord works in mysterious ways. And it wasn't but 10 years ago where China was viewing climate change as a plot foisted on it by the West to slow down its development by insisting that it share an equal burden in controlling greenhouse gas emissions, carbon emissions. It came around because it did ultimately see its self-interest, not only in cleaning up conventional pollution, but also that climate change was an enormous threat to China. And then the U.S., which had been leading this charge, suddenly reversed course. And you had Donald Trump, who's a climate denier, who may pull out of all of these agreements and sort of neuter the U.S.'s leadership role in this front. Very alarming, very dangerous, because I think if you view as I do, this is the challenge of all challenges of the next decade. To have the U.S. gone missing is dangerous. However, I think the U.S. does have a kind of a curious advantage, just as when people get heart attacks, you get compensatory circulation. I think Washington may fall out of the climate change wager, but I think we see the cities and states, corporations, and civil society kind of moving in to play an even more sort of forceful role. So I think in a curious way, the U.S. may still be able to meet certain commitments, even without Washington at the helm, but one would much prefer to see it otherwise.
And when it comes to China, there is actually self-interest and pragmatism involved. This is not a sort of hippie save the earth thing for China. They have real environmental degradation that they're dealing with, real protests that are happening around that. And as a result, it seems like China has actually de facto become the leader on renewable energy and the technologies that may actually make the big difference when it comes to averting climate change.
Yes, I think China's leadership in this is greatly increased and should be extolled. It may be that they come to play a more pronounced role as the U.S. as a nation state, as its role recedes. The problem is, if you look all around the compass rose, U.S. leadership, even in its sort of compromised state, was critical to the world sort of functioning. And it did lead in a lot of ways, both in terms of systems and values, but also in terms of institutions and organizations. And if it is sort of now taken out of the game, it's going to have a profound effect on the way the whole world interacts and whether we can deal with global problems.
Orville Schell, thank you so much for all your insights and for joining us on Ethics Matter.
Pleasure.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.